So with that, I'd like to introduce today's guest. To kick off this new semester, we are very fortunate to begin with an outstanding guest, Karen Kaplan. Karen is the chairman and CEO of Hill Holliday, one of the largest and most successful advertising agencies in the country. She has consistently epitomized what makes Hill Holliday great: energy, optimism, passion, smarts, and loyalty. I can attest to this personally as we've been talking this morning. A driving force behind Hill Holliday's growth to more than $1 billion in annual billings, she's been recognized by Business Insider and Advertising Age as one of the most influential women in advertising. Her leadership has helped build an impressive list of premier clients, including Bank of America, Cadillac, Capella University, Celgene, Chili's, Dunkin' Donuts, Harvard Pilgrim Healthcare, Johnson & Johnson, John Hancock, LG Home Appliances USA, Liberty Mutual, Major League Baseball, Merrill Lynch, Novartis, Olympic Paint and Stains, Red, Smuckers, Supercuts, TJX, and Verizon Wireless. In other words, she's already involved in your life. She serves on the board of directors for numerous civic and professional organizations and is a member of the Clinton Global Initiative, an action-oriented community of the most effective CEOs, heads of state, Nobel Prize winners, and non-governmental leaders in the world. She's also a trustee of Fidelity Investment Strategic Advisors Funds and a director of Vera Bradley. I look forward to asking her about how she makes these decisions and how a large organization can maintain quality and consistency in the creative realm. So please join me in welcoming Karen Kaplan.
Thank you. Thank you, George. I must say, I kind of liked standing in the wings there, listening to George say all those lovely things about me. Thank you very much. This is a great auditorium. You guys are blessed to have such a wonderful place to come and to study. So George tells me that the idea behind the guest lecture series this semester is to bring in outside experts who can add to your conversation and your discussion in the class, but I think it's only fair to warn you that I intend to get as much out of this as you do. I'm not officially here on a recruiting trip, but by the time I finish with my remarks, I hope that you'll understand just how critical design thinking is to the future of advertising, of my business. And if I happen to persuade a few of you smart young people to come work at Hill Holliday, it's all good, right? So I want to start with a very basic question, which is how I define the word advertising. I think of an ad as a piece of communication that is trying to sell you something. I've been in the advertising business my entire career, 32 years, which is crazy because I'm only 39 years old. And in that time, I've seen the industry change in countless ways. But the last couple of years is when I've seen the most interesting change of all. And that is the incredible expansion of what we consider to be an ad. And I think that's why we've also seen the advertising business start to adopt the language and the processes of the design world. So this morning, I'll tell you why I think this has happened and what it's meant for the advertising industry, and I'll tell you specifically about some of the changes that I'm driving at Hill Holliday to adapt to this way of thinking. Sound good? Okay, you gotta give me a little something back. Sound good? There you go. There you go. So until recently, I think people had a pretty good understanding of what constituted advertising. Let's take a look at Coke, which is obviously one of the most recognizable brands in the world, and we'll take a look at how a person might experience Coke's advertising. By the way, Coke, you didn't hear Coke on that list that George mentioned of Hill Holliday clients, but although it's not a Hill Holliday client, I am entitled to brag about it because my son works on it at another agency on the West Coast. I used to go around telling people that my son's on Coke, and then somebody pointed out that that may not be the right way to phrase it, so I should specify that my son works on Coca-Cola. Anyhow, let's take a look at how somebody might experience Coke's advertising, right? In a magazine, on a billboard, or on television. And what these three pieces of communication have in common is that they're all things that were made to be seen, right? So let's think about the questions that drive a creative process that's about making things for people to see. You might ask yourself, how can I capture someone's attention? Because whether they're reading a magazine or they're walking down the street past your billboard or they're making a decision about whether to change the channel or not when they're watching television, you need them to look at your work. You'd ask yourself, how can I provoke an emotional response? Because we've known for a long time, at first just by instinct, and today based on the latest brain science, that emotions are critical to advertising success. And you might ask yourself, how can I persuade the viewer? What can I say, what can I show that will make them want to buy the thing that I'm advertising? So these are all very worthwhile questions, but let's think about these questions in the context of the first word in the design process that I understand you'll be applying in this course, which is the word empathy. These questions aren't really grounded in empathy. If you just look at the verbs, right, capture, provoke, persuade, they're all fundamentally about the creator's objectives, not the recipients, right? So that's not empathy. All advertising is based on a real consumer insight, right? Or at least it should be. But I think there's a distinction that can be drawn between consumer insight and genuine empathy. The purpose of the consumer insight in advertising has historically been to find the lever that will activate a sale. Whereas I think empathy in the design world is much more selfless. An advertising insight might be rooted in empathy, but it really doesn't have to be. And in the past, when the advertiser's primary relationship to the audience was one way, that creator to viewer, one way, empathy was a nice to have, but it really wasn't a requirement for success. So what's changed? In a word, digital. Digital has changed everything in my business. In 2013, for the first time, the amount of time people spend with digital surpassed the amount of time they spend with television. People still spend tons of time watching TV, or more broadly, watching online content, but at the same time, the way people are watching TV has made it less likely they'll see ads. Show of hands, how many of you are bingers, binge watch, right? We find a show that we like on Netflix or Amazon Prime, and we plow through every episode we can get our hands on. It's all the TV with none of the advertising. Some of the best television content today, the stuff that is really shaping culture and driving conversation, doesn't contain advertising. These shows don't even accept ads. So TV is shrinking, at least as a delivery system for advertising, and digital is growing. And when we look more closely at how people are spending time in digital channels, it's all about mobile. More than half of our time spent in digital is mobile, and we're on a course for mobile to be the dominant media channel. So how do people relate to ads in this mobile environment? They swipe, tap, touch, like, and share. Mobile isn't just visual, it's tactile. In this environment, an ad isn't something a person just sees, it's something they use. As simple as that distinction is, I think it's the critical change in the ad business that has us looking to design thinking for inspiration. We all know that Walmart wants to own low prices, right? On the left is how Walmart communicated that in the past, but on the right is a new utility they've launched called Savings Catcher. A user can scan in their receipt and the app automatically checks for competitive prices and it credits you back if it finds a lower price. And I think this is a great example of how advertising is becoming something that people can use. And when you have to think about people actually using things that you make, you're not just in the communications business, you're in the design business. So my comments so far bring us up to the present day, a moment when people are spending half their media time in environments where they become users of a brand's communications, not just viewers. But the important thing to understand is that this trend is really just getting started. Whether you call it the Internet of Things or the real world web, as PSFK does in this great report, the next frontier of digital is about the everyday objects we constantly interact with becoming connected to the internet. Our cars, our homes, our accessories, and even our pets. The forecast is for 30 billion devices to become internet connected in the next 5 years. As this space emerges, digital will be redefined not as a place you go, but as a layer that surrounds you constantly. And that really changes the way we have to think about digital communications and represents what I think about as the third era of digital. The first era of the web was about sites, right? Destinations that people visited to find information and entertainment. The second era, which I'd say we're still in today, has been framed around social. As Paul Adams, formerly lead designer at Facebook, talks about, it's a web that is organized around people and their connections. In the next era, the one that's right around the corner, I think of as the contextual era. Sites and social are still really important, but they're ingredients, and context becomes the organizing principle. The contextual era is what happens when we're surrounded by an always-on internet that is embedded in every aspect of our lives. Context is about people and places and a moment in time. It's about surfacing the appropriate piece of communication in a specific situation, and it's always fluid because the same person should be communicated with differently based on the changing context that they find themselves in. How many of you are familiar with Google Now? Anybody use Google Now? Google Now, I think, is probably the best early example of an internet experience organized around context. Google is trying to take everything it knows about you, which is a lot, and surface the right piece of information without being asked by the user. When people are surrounded by the internet all the time, as advertisers, we have to ask ourselves, how can we be useful? What do people want from us at this very moment? And of course, you can't solve for context without being driven by empathy, without really trying to deeply understand a user's specific needs at any given moment. Let's look at the smartwatch as one potential environment that shows how our approach needs to incorporate design thinking as we wade into the contextual era. This was a piece on the right there, a piece published by Google called Design Principles of Android Wear. And it's a guide for developers who are beginning to think about how to create experiences people interact with on smartwatches. This is very timely because, as you know, tomorrow Apple is going to announce, among many other things, hopefully their smartwatch. Smartwatches are a medium that most people have never encountered and that most developers have never developed for. And the 4 principles that Google suggests are: be contextually aware and smart, be glanceable, design for zero or low interaction, and be helpful. This is a much more humble existence for brands who in the past thought about how to be disruptive and how to be immersive. Now the rules of the game are suggesting being glanceable and low interaction. But there's great power in this more humble approach based on context. Google describes Android Wear as providing a smart connection to the rest of the world while respecting the user's attention. Isn't that great? They say Android wearables are aware of the user's situation and state and helpfully display the right information at the right time. They're talking specifically about wearable devices, but the same principles could and should be applied to any of the billions of internet-connected devices that will bring us into the contextual era. Now I want to tell you about a couple projects that we're working on at Hill Holiday that are inspired by and dependent on user context. The first is the Dunkin' Donuts Pebble smartwatch app. I don't know if any of you are Pebble users, but Pebble was the first smartwatch to market. It launched in 2013 after a successful Kickstarter campaign, and now it has about 400,000 users. We decided it would be an interesting experiment to make it easier for Dunkin' customers to use their Pebble as a way to pay. And in fact, this app, which is about to launch, will be one of the first e-commerce apps on the Pebble platform. So our innovation team built a prototype. They took it to the Dunkin' around the corner from our office to see if it would work. These guys, we call them internally, we call them the nerd herd. And they're like, it's great, they get so excited. And you can see the woman who works at Dunkin' was just as excited to see that it actually worked. So these guys just built the prototype on their own time because they were excited about it, enthusiastic about it. They went out and tested it, and then we brought it to our clients as a potential idea to bring to market. And a couple months later, after collaborating with Pebble, ta-da, it's going to be a real product in the real world. Their design challenge was to make this experience as easy as possible, to actually make it more convenient than taking your smartphone out of your pocket, because who's got time for that? The team accomplished that by creating the app as what's called a watch face, which means all a user has to do is push one button to pay from their existing Dunkin' account. I think that's pretty cool. The second example is an app we're working on for the Friends of the Boston Public Garden. Millions of people visit the public garden every year, but many of them don't know about all the wonderful things that are in there. Our team thought about how people could use their smartphones to get more out of their experience, but in a way that didn't result in people walking around the garden with their heads down looking at a screen, which kind of defeats the purpose of a walk in the park, right? The solution we came up with was an audio tour that requires essentially no user interaction once you begin your walk around the grounds. There are 17 different points of interest in the garden, and at each of these locations, we've attached iBeacon sensors to trees and benches so that when the user approaches, the audio content automatically begins. So the context of this app dictated that the experience be passive and hands-free, and never a distraction. I think it's a great example of technology adding the most value by getting out of the way. So the Dunkin' example is about the internet in your watch. The public garden example is about the internet in a park. And they both point to the future that I'm talking about, which is where the internet is always around us. We interact with it on an as-needed and totally fluid basis throughout the course of our day. I think this quote from Andy Whitlock of the design firm Made by Many very nicely captures this idea about where digital is going. Things are digital when the internet is in them, not when they're in the internet. So if you're tracking with me so far, advertising has become something that people use, and context is critical. And design thinking is the path that can help us create context-aware, usable pieces of communication. But there's an important question that we haven't talked about yet, which is, what are we designing for? Now, of course, every design challenge is different and has its own unique solution, but in my world, the world of advertising, there is a fundamental requirement we're always solving for, no matter what the specifics of the assignment. The messy, wonderful exploration process is always about solving for choice. For a long time, advertisers were guaranteed an audience for the things they made for people to see. So we thought a lot about the mechanics of distribution with the operating assumption that our work would be seen. But today, we have to assume that our work won't be seen unless someone chooses to spend time with it. And the mechanics of acceptance are now what guide our thinking. And it's just much more difficult in a digital world to make people spend time with something they don't want to. I'll give you an example. You know the little skip this ad link that pops up when you're interrupted with a video ad? According to Adweek, when given the choice, 94% of people skip the ad. And the remaining 6%, by the way, are the mothers of the people who created the ads. Think about Facebook, which is where people spend more time than any other environment, and most of that time is spent on mobile. Facebook can load your feed up with ads, but they can't make you pay attention. There was a pretty interesting sort of behind-the-scenes story in the New York Times recently that talked about how Facebook workshops with advertisers to come up with content people will choose to spend time with. They have a name for the kind of ad they're trying to create. They call them thumb stoppers, right? So ads that make people stop flicking through the feed and pay attention. And that phrase, thumb stoppers, is just another way of saying choice. It acknowledges that there's no way to make people endure an interruption in the world of usable advertising. It's about choice. So how do you figure out what ads people will choose to spend time with? Let me tell you about 3 approaches we're taking at Hill Holliday to create choice. I think you'll see some similarities to the framework that you're using in this class. The first is tapping into the power of the unconscious. I've talked a lot about digital so far because it represents such a large portion of the time people spend with brands today, but the principles of choice apply to all communications, online and offline. Even advertising that runs on live linear television is choice-based today because 4 out of 5 viewers are watching television with another device in hand. That means that when your commercial comes on, it needs to be just as interesting as all the wonderful distractions waiting for somebody on their iPhone. One of the ways we do that is to tap into the power of unconscious motivations. Believe it or not, 95% of all decisions are made unconsciously. Now, I know you find that to be true in college, but believe me, that keeps up all the way through. We decide emotionally, and then we post-rationalize our decisions. At Hill Holliday, we talk about these as motives and alibis. The motives are the unconscious drivers that really lead to behavior change, and the alibis are the things we tell ourselves to justify our decisions. At Hill Holliday, we've built out a framework called COMET that helps ground our work in the right emotional motivation. So COMET stands for Core Motivation Elicitation Technique, and this wheel defines 8 underlying emotions that drive all human behavior. And identifying the right emotional motivation, or as we call it, emotivation, is a key step for us in defining the problem. If we can make sure that our strategy and our work are activating the right emotional trigger, there's a much better chance that someone will choose to watch it. In a recent campaign for LG home appliances, we identified empathy as the emotivation based on our finding that moms were looking for a trusted co-conspirator. Within our wheel, that ladders back to connection because the end benefit of empathy is feeling more connected to others. And here's how that understanding of the emotivation was translated into an ad.
$3.75. That's hot.
So I think one of the reasons that campaign has been so well received is that unlike most advertising that's targeted to moms, this is focused on the motives that really drive her and not the alibis, like, whiter whites, brighter brights, better cookies. The second approach that we're taking is one you'll definitely find familiar, which is experience design. In the past year, we decided to formally launch an experience design practice at Hill Holiday. The team's mantra is this: we don't make things for brands, we make things for people from brands. Usable things, choice-based things. Our process is a close cousin to the one that you're following with 4 key steps: immersion, mapping, design, and implementation. But mainly it's about putting up stickies. You can't have a design process without stickies, and hopefully that was the first thing that George taught you in this class. It's all about the stickies. Our experience design team is at work right now on some really fascinating design projects, like what's the ideal brand experience from the inside of a connected car? What could we create that will help people save more money? And how can we help people stay motivated to make it through a graduate degree program? This is a small team today at Hill Holiday, but I think it will be one of our fastest growing offerings because it's hard to imagine a client problem that wouldn't benefit from this way of working. And the third approach is rapid prototyping. One of the best ways to find out what people will choose is to simply build some version of it, test it, and learn from your results. We don't always need to be right in advance. We can let the marketplace tell us what's right based on their behavioral reaction to our work. So this is the head of our innovation and technology team, John Running, testing out an EEG headset. And the device is reading our agency practice dedicated to rapid prototyping of digital products and services. At the beginning of the year, the Beacon team made a commitment to ship 1 new project every single month, and I'm happy to say that they've honored that commitment. We've done projects for our own internal benefit, like this one, which is called Brand Feed, which is a social analytics platform we built to help our teams get faster, more useful feedback and insights in real time from our social programs. This is Inspiral. The name comes from inspiration in real life, and it's an app that we built that actually encourages and rewards our brand planners for the time they spend outside the office. It's kind of like Foursquare for creative inspiration, so we don't want people sitting at their desks all the time. We want them out getting inspired. And Beacon has also led to some great client work, like this one for what we call Tweet Hearts. We took the classic Sweethearts conversation candies, and we made it possible to turn a tweet into a customized Tweet Heart message that could be shared on Twitter and then actually turned into a personalized bag of physical candy delivered to your door. So that stuff's all great fun, but to me, Project Beacon isn't play. It's not a side project. It's a real agency investment because I believe speed and iteration are 2 of the hallmarks of modern marketing. And Project Beacon is one of the key ways that we build those muscles. So from ads people see to ads people use, solving for context, designing for choice, making things for people from brands, those are the themes and the principles that represent the future growth of my business. So I think you can probably see just how critical design thinking is to my business and how that will only increase in the future. And hopefully I've got some of you thinking about how you might be able to apply what you're learning in this course to a future in advertising. So in a shameless attempt to recruit you, say hello to Michael Clinton. Michael leads our internship group at Hill Holiday, which runs throughout the year and which is something that we take great pride and we're very serious about. So if you'd like to bring your design thinking chops and be considered for an internship at Hill Holiday, please feel free to reach out to Michael, tell him Karen sent you, and thank you all so much for your time and attention. It's been a pleasure.
Well, I have to say, for starters, it's a very effective recruiting guy. Super handsome. He looks like he's right out of an Apple ad.
Oh, no, he's fantastic. Adorable. Really smart. Wonderful. You'll all love him.
Well, thank you. That was just a spectacularly on-message presentation. I should say that I first met Karen when she gave a presentation at a CEO breakfast that's Northeastern sponsored, and I had to be dragged to this thing because usually these things are, you know, CEOs are often not good at this kind of thing, actually, surprisingly. She was so superb, I almost had a heart attack. And went up and spoke with her right away. But I'm very glad that you tied your talk into some of these themes that we've been using. And the bit about empathy was so good because I thought the making clear how advertising perhaps wasn't really required to be empathetic before, and how now times have really changed. And it's all about technology, I guess, but I also, this is a long-winded way of getting to the question, which is, when I first saw the presentation that you gave at the CEO breakfast, it was about how we are in a totally different era.
Yeah.
And it's more horizontal, it's more interactive and less dictated. Maybe you can say a couple words about how that broad umbrella relates to what you talked about here today.
Yeah, so so that was an audience of CEOs, as George said. So when I talk to people in the business and students, I sort of talk about what it is that we in the agency world need to change. But when I talk to CEOs and corporate people, I talk about what they need to change. And so that talk was all about how we've moved from what was known as the institutional era, from a corporate perspective, from the institutional era where people trusted institutions of all kinds, not just banks and oil and gas companies, but Congress and the medical system and the organized religion. And over the course of 40 years, trust in all of those institutions has just plummeted to an all-time low, with good reason, some may say. And then the only institution that's achieved greater trust in those 40 years has been the military, because of what's going on in the world. So the point is, we need to move companies from thinking and solving problems within the context of being in the institutional era, where people just trusted everything they said, to what we call now the human era. And the transparency of the internet and sort of many other shifts in the world today have driven. And so when you think about how to behave and how you instruct your employees to behave and how you talk to customers and consumers in the human era, it's totally different. You're talking at eye level, you're not talking from on high. Everything you do and say, all the ways that your company and your brand behave have to be completely different. And that was the subject of that talk.
Well, it seems, it's so, I ask because it's so interesting, because the talks actually seem extremely related, because in the technology portion, this is all tools for that greater transparency, communication, thumb stopping, getting users, colleagues, participants engaged in this. And it does seem super different than being instructed on why you should buy something. Instead, getting engaged with an environment of like-minded people, whose interests are the same, and that will then result in purchasing something.
Which is such a better, if you can just figure out how to adapt your product, service, company, offering, brand to that, it's such a better way to go, because you're relying on the consumer. You're creating these brand ambassadors or product ambassadors to go out and amplify your message using their social sphere. So you can actually partner with consumers, customers, whatever your constituency is, and have a conversation. Gone are the days when a lot of this work that we did studying sort of the difference between the institutional era and the human era came out of our work with Bank of America, which starting 5 years ago, was, I will use the technical marketing term, they were in the shit from a brand and a business perspective. So tremendous regulatory scrutiny, it was sort of the perfect storm of all these external forces, and they had a burning platform, and they really couldn't stay with the institutional era thinking. And so we helped to kind of push them in, not just through their advertising, but every way that they interact with their employees and all their constituents, to behave more in keeping with the human era. And it's helped their brand and business tremendously.
Yeah. I think that sort of thing can't be overstated, that these are, and I appreciate so much the point about design thinking being an increasingly, like rapidly increasingly important aspect of the sort of toolkit that young people need to be able to succeed in the world. Just a brief digression. There was a great bit in your Human Era book, or booklet, little pamphlet report that you guys did with Lippincott. And it was an example of user-generated content, I suppose, or categorization of Netflix content. You know what I'm going to say.
Yeah.
The users themselves, you guys, created a category on Netflix that I don't think anybody would have done from the top down, and it was called Sentimental Dysfunctional Family Dramas.
Right.
And I thought, that sounds like a folder I'd click on. And I thought, that is probably not something that would have been directed from on high, and it is something that came organically.
There is a genre that we refer to as OPD, Other People's Drama, which kind of years ago in the early days of reality TV, which started with, Housewives and Big Brother and the early ones, we kind of said, we couldn't quite figure out why people wanted to watch this. And so OPD, Other People's Drama.
Maybe that.
You feel like you're normal after
my
you watch
situation
this.
is
I'm not that messed up.
I do still wonder why we need so much evidence of that.
Yeah.
But be that as it may.
Well, the thing is, the channels keep pumping it out because it's really cheap.
Yes.
To, the dramas, those 4 phenomenal dramas that I had up on the screen are super, super expensive to produce in terms of talent, everything. They're like films.
Right.
And reality TV, gets shot on somebody's iPhone in the middle of the night. Nobody gets paid.
Right. So I thought that you covered very well the business about sort of the shadings of empathy and why it's so important. But the second term that we use, we're using as the sort of structure for the course, is define. But I would almost immediately adjust that and say define or understand the question or clarify the problem, or because it seems like certainly for design firms, and it seems for advertising firms too, number one, you have clients who aren't necessarily the users. You have 2 different groups. The people who are paying you are not necessarily the people whose minds you really have to get into, whose experiences you have to modify or improve or whatever. It's also true that your clients probably oftentimes do not understand all the problem, the full nature of the problem. That's why they got in touch with you. If they could design the house themselves, they wouldn't have called me. So I wonder, and this is really interesting to me, I wonder how a big firm goes about systematically trying to clarify. What are the processes you use for trying to clarify the problem? I come to you, our sales are in the toilet, it's a disaster. Karen, you gotta help me. And you, I guess, first have to say, okay, calm down, let's figure out what the problem is.
So defining the problem is obviously the most important part of any process, but of our process, because if we're misaligned on the problem, even 1%, that just gets incrementally, exponentially, that 1% off gets exponentially larger and larger and larger as we get into solutions, and then we're just shooting in the dark. So the first thing I want to do is find out what your appetite is. And I always say there's nothing like a burning platform. So some clients who really need, the best clients are clients who really need help, whether it's a business issue or a brand issue, and who have an appetite to really solve the problem. So they're not just trying to get through the next quarter and save their job and all these sort of low-level objectives. They really want to drive business for their company. They really want their brand to be better regarded. They really want to get into the public conversation and popular culture. So first, it's finding out what kind of appetite a client might have. And I always say, clients know their business better, and what an agency brings is we know the consumer better. So they have to respect, and I don't say that in an arrogant way, but I tell account management people at Hill Holiday all the time, you don't have to know as much about the product or the service. A lot of our clients are very complex. You don't have to know as much as the client knows, but you need to know more. You need to know enough to solve the problem, and then you need to know much more than they know about consumers. And to your point, that's why they seek an outside perspective, because there's certain behaviors that transcend every category. And if you're trying to change behavior, you really need to understand those unconscious motivations that I talked about. So defining the problem, I always say, very simple. Who is it for and what is it for? Two very, very simple questions. And if you can't, after you do all of your work to define the project, project, if you can't stand back and say, who is it for and what is it for, then you failed. And I think our work for Dunkin' Donuts, if I might give an example, is a great example of that. In 2006, we developed the tagline, "The platform America runs on Dunkin'." And the way we sort of took, we weren't asked by the client. They had a new CEO and a new CM, a new chief executive officer, a new chief marketing officer. So, that's a time when an agency really has to go back and have a meeting with themselves and say, we've got to up our game, because typically that's when clients make an agency change. But we gave ourselves the assignment of this new platform. And we said, who is it for and what is it for? And the who is it for is, we decided Starbucks was very convenient sort of enemy, so we were going to push against Starbucks. So it's for the everyday Joe, the everyday person. And what is it for is the for the person who's keeping America running. So it's not for people who sit around Starbucks in couches with their laptops, listening to music and doing whatever they're doing all day. It's people who have a job, who've got to get to work, and it's not a demographic, it's a psychographic. So you see, I always say in the parking lot of Dunkin', you see like a Maserati next to a pickup truck, next to like a family van, next to Volkswagen Beetle. So whether you're a nurse or a doctor or a construction worker or a CEO, you feel like you need to get going. You need to get in, get out, and get your fuel for the rest of the day, because this country relies on you to keep it going. So that's where America Runs on Dunkin' came from. Right. And once we had defined that problem, we've been working off of that platform ever since 2006, and you can work off of it for the rest of time.
It's genius. I mean, the idea that there's an overriding theme or concept, we might call it, you're calling it a platform, is you really see the power of that in advertising, because you see, for example, when you show the Coca-Cola stuff, you see all the myriad ways in which that message is transmitted, and they're really consistent, even though they can accommodate all kinds of different circumstances.
Right. Yeah.
But now, what happens when, and I'm genuinely curious about this, as I said to you before, I don't know that many people in advertising, although I feel a tremendous kinship with the kind of work that gets done. So I'm a client and I come in, I just, I want to, everything's going pretty much okay, but we'd like to see sales go up a little bit, but I think I'm secure in my job, and
yeah.
and you see, oh my gosh, you guys are unaware of a giant cliff coming in your world, like you're about to be just killed by Spotify or whoever's going to, whatever the next thing is that's going to crush Spotify. And you see that I don't see that at all. I'm just looking for can't you get me 10% more sales? How does that go?
So that's a really interesting question, George. So that's the So typically,
It does happen.
it
right?
does happen. So that's sort of the conundrum in my business, and this may be a little too inside baseball, around do you wait for a competitive pitch? Do you wait for a client to go out on the market with an RFP and request for proposal and compete with other agencies after they've decided they need to spend $100 million? Or do you try to go shake that business loose from people who don't know they have a problem? The upside of that is there's no competition. You don't have to, there's no like beauty contest of, but the downside is they don't know they have a problem. So I think typically it's more productive to work with people who know they have a problem.
Yeah.
And I'm trying to think if I can use an example. Does anybody have parents that work at Staples? So, because I know we'll never work with Staples, we were trying to be helpful to Staples about 5 years ago, and they did not see the train coming.
Wow.
Yeah, I mean, on the one hand, they say we don't compete with Office Max, Office Depot, we compete with Amazon, which is exactly right. But on the other hand, they've got all these giant stores, and they're still
basically competing with Office
talking
Max
about pizza boxes and janitorial. It's like if as long as you tell them that we have not just office supplies, we have janitorial supplies, and we have pizza boxes, we'll be all set. And it's kind of like, not so much.
Right.
So
That's interesting.
It's not very productive.
It's analogous to this is where
They're lovely people, by the way, because I just realized this is like webcast or something. Lovely people.
But it is very analogous to architecture, where you have clients who see the problem. Either it's not a problem, just reproduce.
Yeah.
Like here's a picture of the house. Can you guys do this?
Yeah.
Or there's nothing wrong with the way everything's laid out right now, whether it's an academic campus or a business space, and that can be problematic.
Yeah, exactly.
I wanted to get back to the hilarious bit about the woman using her oven.
LG.
LG.
Yeah.
Great, very, very, very clever, and it's. Of course, it's smart because it does try to figure out what people's actual motivations are. I mean, this is a real empathy, I guess you'd say, in the sense that that is so different. That not only is it funny and sweet, but it's right. I mean, and I think about again a tremendous analogy to the actual design of a kitchen. I can't think of any part of a contemporary house that is more misaligned with what people actually do with their time than the contemporary high-end kitchen. If we haven't been there, we've seen it in a magazine. The stove has 8 burners. It has the ability to cook enough food for an aircraft carrier. The couple lives alone and eats out mostly. And it's a gigantic, extremely technologically complex room that is mostly used as a place to put a bowl for fruit.
Yeah.
And I think of it just because when I looked at those stoves or ovens, I thought, it's so much like the explosion of stainless steel refrigerators that happened, 15 years ago. And, they're about something else. They're not about, of course you can keep the food cold, but that's not the decision-making item at all.
So
there must be so many products like this.
Yeah. Well, for me, I don't cook, so I call it it's theater. My kitchen is theater.
Yes.
We were building our house 20 years ago, and we were deliberating about, of course we were going to have double ovens, of course.
Of course, because of...
And then like a, bread warmer or something I literally never opened in 20 years. And I remember my husband saying, double ovens? Really? You need just a toaster oven.
Right.
We were fine. But it's the same reason I had a piano in my house. It's theater.
Well, it is. It's about, more charitably, it's about who we want to be, not necessarily who we are at that moment. I mean, it's aspirational, right?
Exactly.
And I think understanding that is really helpful in all design decisions. In other words, it's not always solving the immediate problem. It's there. I mean, you speak the language of emotional choices better than I do, because it's obviously so true. And the 95% figure is just flabbergasting, and it makes you realize, obviously in politics, but in lots of things, that you can be told one thing, and with the eye to you're making a decision based on something else altogether. If you'd never doubted that, I mean, that's this idea that 95% of the decision making is emotional, it really rings true.
I'm a big Malcolm Gladwell fan. I don't know if you guys have read Malcolm Gladwell. Yeah, fantastic. So his first book, I think, was called The Tipping Point.
Yes.
And before he was super famous, we had him come and speak at Hill Holiday. And I mean, that was not a book written for advertising, but it was incredibly instructive. And I actually think he's fantastic. Everything he writes is right on. I don't know, Outliers is like, I'm a huge Outliers fan. If you haven't read Outliers, read it. It's a great book.
I haven't. I've read probably excerpts of it or reviews of it, which is the poor man's reading method. New York Times Book Review, this sort of thing. But I know the basic premise about, isn't the Outliers the one about the 10,000 hours?
Exactly. Exactly.
Well, just because you're such an ideal guest for this course, because it's everything you guys do is in this vein. And as you were saying, even if that wasn't true in advertising 25 years ago, it is certainly becoming true now, and as we were talking about before, becoming true in far more fields. So we have lots of students in architecture, for example, who don't realize fully, they go into architecture because it's a thing. There's actually a profession with the same name as the major, wow, that's great. But it's also true they're learning how to think this way in ways that could be applicable in all kinds of fields. And I think that's true, by the way, for all of you who are not architecture students, but who are students who are developing expertise in different areas, that this design thinking is really a lens through which to look at the world. So let's, I mean, we could talk about define for the rest of the time, because that whole business about questioning the question, understanding what problem it is you're trying to solve is just essential. But I want to sort of cycle through these things and then give the students a chance to ask some questions as well. These terms, by the way, the specific words of these terms come from the D School at Stanford. And there are different lists that one could use to serve as a kind of architecture of design thinking. These have a good pedigree. I don't personally love the word ideate, just because it's one of those things, that one of the many new transitive verbs that we've created in this past century. But essentially, the process, the iterative enterprise. You talked about it in a couple of the divisions of the little sort of, let's say, fledgling startups within Hill Holiday, which by itself is an interesting development. But like how, we spoke of some people I know in that industry, and they seem very much, they're kind of, as you said, averse to a specific method. Right, because it's
allergic to process.
Allergic to a formalized process.
Yeah.
Right. So how do you institutionally, this must be very interesting, it's just like in any creative business, but how do you try to institutionalize a regularity of quality when everybody says, don't bother me, I'm going to be a genius in my office. And then later, like on Mad Men, Don Draper will just give the speech, ad-lib the speech in the meeting, you get the job, and everybody goes, what just happened?
So that's the rub. That's the rub with my job and with advertising today, because it's a business of independent thinkers, right? And creative people are typically, by definition, introverts. And to George's point, they want to be left alone, and everything's intuitive, and they're geniuses, and they'll come up with it. But it's become a much more sophisticated process and a much more transparent process. I mean, so at Mad Men, I don't know how many of you watch it. I actually started watching it because obviously it's my business, but I early on in the first season became a fan because of the social commentary. So the way that you see women, people of color, gay and lesbian people treated is really, really interesting. So that's the 60s. I started in advertising in the early 80s. It wasn't that much different in terms of sort of the process and some of the things that went on, a lot of drinking, and we can just switch the subject right there. But in the old days, it was a very siloed process, right? So the account people met with the client and found out what the problem is. And then they'd throw it over the transom to it was before brand planning was even a thing, which came over from England in the 90s. So it was like the research people. And then the research people would do their thing, and then they would write the creative brief, and they would throw that over the transom to a writer and an art director. Just two people. That was the team. And I think if you watch Mad Men, you saw the advent of a team. Used to be the writer would just come up with the idea and give it to the art department, who would literally, a pejorative term in my business for an art director is a wrist, because they just draw the picture, but that's the way it was. When I started, there was a team, art director, copywriter, but just those two. And they'd go into a dark room for 2 or 3 weeks, and they would emerge with the idea, one idea, an idea, and everybody they would just, ta-da, they'd present it, and everybody would just applaud and bow, and then it would go right to the client. And it just doesn't happen like that. It's messy, as I said, and it's exploratory, and it's much more like the design development process than the traditional advertising process, where, to George's point, it's iterative. And I, at one point, about 5 years ago, I called the CEO of IDEO and Continuum, which are two very, very good design firms here in Boston. And I went and met with their CEOs to talk about this, because I could see that this process wasn't going to hold up in the contextual era, in the human era, and in this era of digital. And so a lot of the things that I learned are now just sort of de rigueur for our business. And what it's the silos are gone. There are more than two people. I mean, our chief creative officer won't even take a brief if there's not a technologist in the room often. And so, but it's very uncomfortable for people to have to do what they do with 5 or 6 instead of 1 or 2.
Other people watching.
Yeah, and so there's a lot of, it's a little bit unnatural, and so there's resistance. I mean, this is very, very tricky. And I'm sure the younger people in our business are being brought up with this more open, transparent, collaborative process. So it'll just sort of naturally, the problem will solve itself. But there are many people who really still really struggle with it, and it's just the way it has to be.
Well, especially as you move onto these new platforms, it's so analytics driven, it would seem to me.
Yes.
That it's not just like a survey.
Which more enlightened creative people will say is very, very helpful, because that brand feed, which was one of the examples I showed you, where you can, as a creative person, you can see real time how, say, content on Facebook, for example, is doing, and so you can do more of what's doing well and take away the stuff that isn't doing so well, and so it makes you more successful. And creative people who don't want to listen to feedback and data aren't going to last very long in this business, because everybody gets it at the same time. I mean, what's the point? Why wouldn't you work to be more effective and more successful?
Right. Now, this is, as you can imagine, the analog in architecture is very interesting, because there's really two kinds of big public buildings. There are those that are done for market reasons, which should and do subscribe to the kind of analytics. And then there are those who are done by, like, the art director, copywriter on steroids, the genius architect, who you are to learn from me. In other words, I have made this statement. I persuaded somebody to build this big thing. Well, I know we didn't ask you about it. In fact, and I know you hate it now, but you'll come to like it because it's such genius.
Wrong.
And it's just so wrong. It's so wrong. And I think that architecture is in the throes of the same transformation that you are describing. It will be even thornier, though, because there is the kind of time-based cultural component of architecture in cities that they're not infinitely changeable the way products more or less are, not completely.
And certainly advertising
Yeah.
is today. But that's a complete lack of empathy, right?
Right.
That's, I'm going to do this because it pleases me and I
Correct.
know better. And
Correct.
that's
Absolutely.
just...
It's so interesting that it's like your institutional human error thing. I can't wait to use that in a conversation with some characters I know and to ask them which side of this divide is it that you'd like to be on again.
Yeah.
I see you're advocating for an
Yeah.
old school institutional order.
Doesn't work.
Yeah.
It doesn't work.
Well, it's so true that, I mean, you know, if you look at we were talking about the workspaces earlier and how it's important for creative businesses to have interesting, cool workspaces because our clients would expect that. And they need a little bit of evidence that we know what we're doing. And companies like Google and all these Kendall Square companies are all, of course, trying to reinvent the workspace just as you guys reinvent the communication around products and social media and all the rest. And it's really interesting because, I mean, they don't all succeed. Like, you know, it turns out maybe the completely open office isn't actually, isn't perfect either. Silos are bad, so is chaos, it turns out. And so we're still trying to narrow in on what the right answer is to that sort of thing.
I think there was the first step in this was the knee-jerk reaction was about space. And so I think, and we happened to move from our headquarters in the Back Bay after 30 years, about 6 or 7 years ago, to a new building in the financial district. And that was right around the time when I think there was this obsession with space, particularly in, you know, visual image-driven, you know, industries. And which I think was a good thing, but if you don't change the process and the mindset, then, and you've just changed the space, yet you really haven't accomplished anything.
That's right, that's right. It's an organization. What this really is an integrated change in organizational behavior that has spatial components, it has implications,
That's
it has communications implications.
Yeah.
And so that's really interesting. And I don't see as much work being done on that holistic level as probably should be. Do you know what I mean? Because people still hire design firms to, can you design us some cool space? Yeah. Is sort of the brief. You know what I mean? It's not as idea-driven or concept-driven.
Well, you know, it's interesting, George. When we moved, a couple years leading up to the move, we hired an architect, a great firm, and we started the process. You know, that we started the strategic process. So it was very interesting. To your point, it mirrored exactly our process with our clients. So you have to start by defining the problem, and we came up with 3 strategic design tenets that would be the defining, you know, principles of the design. So before anybody took pen to paper, we did a big sticky exercise that was very strategically focused. We didn't talk about surfaces or color or, you know, how many square feet everybody would get, white or black, and we just focused on sort of what was the strategy, what we were trying to accomplish. And we were very open to that because that's our process. And again, if you're misaligned around that defining the problem piece of it, you're screwed.
Yeah, you know, that's such a good point. That actually explains a lot of architectural failure, is precisely the misalignment between what the two groups, client and designer, think the problem is. That's a longer conversation, but I think it's very true. You've got in your shop the prototyping capacity, capability now, and I'm so impressed that if I heard you right, you're trying to. Are they the group that's producing something every month?
Once a month, yeah.
Boy, that is so impressive.
Yeah.
But it leads me to something that has come up in other contexts in this course, and you alluded to it, but didn't call it out by name. The concept of fast fail.
Yes.
I think it is so instructive. And also, by the way, although these humans all look pretty much the same, most of them are engineering students, which is a just completely discrete type of human. And the concept of fast fail is born of engineering, computer science, I think. And maybe you want to say a little bit, I mean, you alluded to it, but you were talking about how important it is to get to something testable as fast as possible.
Yeah, and so this again is a huge disconnect for a lot of people who've been in my business for a long time. And, I think I said it in my talk earlier, we don't have to have all the answers in advance. We can let the marketplace tell us. That's a new thing. And so when I became CEO a year, 16 months ago, and I grew up at Hill Holiday. I've never worked anywhere else except babysitting and waitressing, which, as I always say, have both come in handy at Hill Holiday. And I'm not kidding. But I was sort of a product of Hill Holiday and the culture, and I love the place. But there was one cultural shift that I was very deliberate about making, and that was around failure and making it permissible to fail. And that's both in terms of the work you do, but even in your career choices. Because we were, 46 years old, 47 years old when I became CEO. I'd been there 32 of those years. And culturally, it was kind of a punitive culture. And that goes with a lot of high performance cultures. Have that. That's sort of the downside of a high performance culture. It's, you better not fail. You better not screw up or you're out. And so I really needed to, to bring that sort of forgiving, make the culture a lot more forgiving. And so we have a annual meeting every year in June to celebrate our anniversary. So it's an annual meeting where we talk about the past, the year in review, and we celebrate all the work, and we talk about what's coming, and then it's just a giant party for the rest of the day. And I always say you can tell the culture of a place by what they celebrate, what are their awards, what are their annual sort of, and we added one. We have three. One is we do a young speaker. We surprise everybody with somebody who's young and hasn't been at Hill Holiday very long. We ask them to speak to the employee base, and no one knows who it is until they take the podium, and they always crush it. But that's about a great idea can come from anywhere, not just the top of the house. And then we have an award for a gentleman who passed away at a young age, about 20 years ago, and that's sort of the Good Citizen Award, the selfless person, the person who takes care of their colleagues the best. And then we have the award named after our founder, which is the big one, $50,000, and it's all about results. And so we added a fourth, which is the Epic Fail Award. And because we want to encourage people, nothing good comes if you're afraid to put yourself out there. And George mentioned one of our clients. It's funny because when you read them alphabetically, it sounds like you're stuttering, but we have Merrill, and then we have Merrill Lynch. Merrill Lynch is a wealth management company. It's part of Bank of America. Merrill is the shoe company. And for their, it's actually going to be at Sundance this year. We created this immersive, what's it called? Ocular Rift, but it's...
IMAX?
No, it's like it was like this, we created this experience that someone literally had 12 GoPro cameras that they put together and created this immersive experience, like an Ocular Rift, and it painstakingly created all the wireframes and all the user experience, everything, and was so excited to have people in the agency try it, and everybody who put it on got sick to their stomach. It made everybody nauseous.
Right.
So that's the guy who got the epic fail. It was like $5,000 or something. I forget what it was, but that's the guy that got the epic fail award.
Right.
So in the old days, that probably would have been punished because we didn't have, we had to call the client and say, we got to go back to the drawing board.
Right.
But I think that speaks to how we work how we have to work iteratively, and we don't have to have all the answers before.
Well, I think it's a great example, and I think that actually for a lot of the engineers in the audience, it's the reason it's so powerful in like software design and in other kinds of prototyping is that you need to find out what the weaknesses are of the thing you're doing, even if it's a really complex thing, really fast. Because sort of in the age before this, I mean, you were speaking about it more as a management culture issue, which is, I think, a completely appropriate thing. But also, I think, it's a work technique that you don't need to know everything about the thing that you're doing while you're speculating about it.
Yeah.
You gotta, okay,
Well,
let's try to put together
yeah.
just enough code that we can test and see if it does this thing.
Yeah.
Does it have all the things that we want? No, not at all. But maybe this is even the right road to be going down, and I'd rather know that here than all the way down here. I think that's sort of, from what I've read, that's kind of where this idea came from, was in like writing software that just takes so much time.
Yeah, well,
and people say, well, I want to see it all finished and done, and then we'll see if it works. No. We're going to make a tiny little piece and see if we can test it to failure in the second week.
And share it with people.
Yeah.
And I always say a little naivete goes a long way in our business. That, that is back to my telling people at Hill Holiday, you don't have to know as much about the client's business as the client does, because sometimes having a little naivete is what sort of gives birth to bigger and better and more bold and robust ideas.
Yeah. I've got a couple more questions for Karen, but I would like you guys to, if any of you want to come up to these mics, we can take some student questions before we finish up. So I'm going to ask you two more questions. One really, I think, easy, and the other one terrifying when you're on camera. Okay, so let's start with the easy one.
Oh, I was going to say, let's go straight to the terrifying one.
You guys, at least in the quick note about the different areas you're in, like whether it's prototyping and advertising, and I guess there must be a research one, or maybe more than one.
Yeah.
Analytics or something like this. Are there some other squares on that grid that you see coming at Hill Holiday? Yeah.
So the basically everything I talked about is sort of brand new.
Yeah,
The idea of the experience design, which is the thing I'm very, very excited about right now. But it's very interesting how. Again, I'm going to refer to a Mad Men analogy. I think it was in the first or the second season. For those of you who watch, I forget the guy's name, Harry or whatever. The guy gets scripts dumped on him that he has to go through, and he goes to Hollywood.
The TV guy.
And he comes back, and his big proposal is, let's start a TV department,
right.
and I'll head up the TV department, which we all laugh at because it's so ridiculous. But we did the same thing when digital sort of started and became a thing. We had a digital department,
right.
which is I think you need a chief digital officer, because somebody's got to do, somebody, as I call it, somebody's got to future-proof you. Somebody's got to have that job of always, being ahead of the game, thought leadership, future-proofing. But we had a silo within Hill Holiday for digital.
Uh-huh.
And it was just as ridiculous as having a TV department. So what happens is you kind of incubate and then you decentralize.
Mm-hmm.
And we did that with our social team. We've done that. We're just in the process of doing that with our content team. And so we've had a content team, which again, it's not vertical, it's not horizontal. Nobody quite knows what to do with it. They have creative people, they have producers, they have editors, they have all the same people that we have in the general agency. Every way to define it doesn't work for me. So you say, oh, they do long form. Like we do 30-second TV. They do long form. Well, that's not exactly true. I mean, I think it's things that are persistent, ongoing platforms. But these are the kind of things. So what we do, George, is we typically will start something and kind of incubate it, and then we'll decentralize it. And so this experience design is the latest and greatest thing that I'm excited about. And you've got to find the next thing before the other guy. So this is what, this is part of the business, is in a business that didn't change, that virtually didn't change at all for 50 years. I mean, these are like every single month we see sea changes. And I always say, just when I was getting bored, the internet came along. So it makes the business very, very exciting, and you're constantly having to kind of invent the next greatest thing to help solve the problem.
I should add as a caveat, the Department of Art and Design has a fabulous new master's program in experience design with some great people
great.
in it, and you should think about it.
Yeah.
Okay,
Terrifying.
here's the terrifying question. What companies communicate their message best, but the terrifying part, and which ones are really not very good at it?
So this
It can include some of your clients,
Yeah, this could be business limiting, George.
but... Okay, well, okay, that's fair enough.
So, you know, it's interesting. I'll take the. I'd like to think all our clients communicate their message well, but the truth is there's varying degrees and depends on how long we've been working with them and who our partners are on the other side. But I will say, I'll use, as an example, I'll use John Hancock, which is a client with whom we've worked. We'll celebrate our 30th anniversary next year. And by the way, the average length of a client agency relationship in my business is like 2.5 years. So it's just extraordinarily long relationship. We've been through 9 CEOs, a demutualization, an IPO. They were acquired by a Canadian company, you know, on and on and on. But and we just launched a new campaign. It was on, I think it was Monday Night Football last week. It broke. Anyway, so the work is always of the moment. And this work that you'll start seeing now, if you watch TV, is very modern and current. But the insight is the same insight that we've been working off of for 30 years. It's the insight that won us the business in the pitch, and that is that John Hancock, that sort of point of difference is that they understand people's problems better than any other financial services company. And so, for me, the best clients are the clients that are really, really game to figure out who they're for, what they're for, sort of, you know, they'll partner with you to define the problem. And then they'll stick with that insight as long as it's relevant. And it's the execution, it's the actual articulation creatively that changes over the years. Right. So I didn't answer your question directly, but it's the clients who are, you know, I mean, they're promiscuous. You know, they go. If there's a client who's had 8 agencies in 9 years, it's probably not the agency's fault. Right. You know, you have to go through. You look at, you know, there's some clients that go through partnerships with fantastic agencies, and if 8 agencies in 9 years can't solve a problem,
maybe people don't know what the problem is.
Maybe people don't want to solve the problem, or they're not good partners. So to me, it's less about individual clients. I always talk about, there's a question that I get asked all the time about, are there any, people have passion categories in my business and passion brands. So automotive, spirits, beer, you know, these are some of the really more sexy categories that people...
And even more emotionally driven in terms of
And
decision.
even more image-driven, emotionally driven. Right. And where there's sort of, frankly, parity typically of the product. And I'm less eager to work with people in my passion categories or among my passion products. I'm looking for the people. So I want that chief marketing officer or that chief executive officer who's got a stomach for doing something that is bold and that's going to change the game, and that's going to be, like, you know, the real honest, genuine partner that you need in order to solve a problem for people. You mentioned, I mean, you can't, in architecture, you can't solve a problem if people don't acknowledge there's a problem.
Right.
So I think I'm looking for people who really want to make a difference, who want to get famous, either themselves, their brands, their companies, who really want to separate themselves from the rest of the pack. And those are few and far between.
Right. It sounds in a way like it's for businesses that have a clear idea of what their objective is.
That's right.
Are much easier to work with than those who are, and I imagine there are a lot of them nowadays in a time of great flux where, are we a content company? Are we a advertising company? You know what I mean? If they're not clear about exactly what role they're going to play in the economy, I can understand how they might make an awkward client because they're not sure.
Or they want help figuring that out, or they genuinely want help figuring that out.
Yeah,
That's a great client. I mean, the farther upstream we can partner with them, the better.
Right.
So what I don't like is when a client calls and says, I need a TV spot and a banner ad. That's usually, they don't need a TV spot and a banner ad. It's like, how did you come to that conclusion? And so for some clients, we work with, what should a new client, what should the positioning be? What should the packaging look like? What should the price point be? What is the white space? What's the need that they're trying to, the unmet need out there that they're trying to fill?
Right. Do we have any questions from the students? Yeah, please, come on up.
Hi.
So in an age in which user engagement with advertisement is based on choice, there has to be like an element of trust that comes along with it. And when I think of the digital era, and trust, the first issue that comes to my mind is privacy. So I'm wondering how you at Hill Holliday balance your desire for that personal data to lead to consumer insights with the consumer's desire to keep some of that data private, and because it leads to a lack of trust sometimes.
Yeah, it's a fantastic question. So before the nude picture cloud thing, there was, I think it was 2 Sundays ago, it might have even been last Sunday, on 60 Minutes. I don't know if any of you saw it, but they ran a, and it was like in the best 60 Minutes, in the way they used to do things, like an expose. And like they used to, now people are like, 60 Minutes, come on in. You'll help me advertise my product.
Right.
60 Minutes used to be like, you see those cameras coming, you get out of town.
Right.
So it was like a real expose, and they were interviewing, I remember the CEO of Epsilon, which is the database company,
Right.
and treating him like he was a criminal. It was like the bare light bulb, and so for me, and I don't mean to take this lightly, but the way I see it, the more information you give me, the better I can be useful to you. So I'm sure there are so many bad actors out there, but they're not in the advertising industry. And so all I'm trying to do is, so for example, just to make it real, if you're in Gmail and you type the word car, and then a car insurance, a Geico, thing pops up on the right, to me that's useful. Or it isn't, and then it's just irrelevant and I just don't have to pay any attention to it. But to me, that's useful and relevant, as opposed, that's me taking information I know about you and then better serving you. So I actually think, and people share their data willingly, so I feel like if you don't want to share your data, don't share your data. And so to me, I think it's a little bit overblown. Like most things, there's probably like 1% of people who have access to data that are bad actors that are doing, and for me, that's for Google and Apple and Facebook to figure out, and that's critical. That, for them, it's a real problem.
If they asked you for help on communicating that message, like how do you think you would go about it? Because I think it does freak a lot of people out. I mean, I think a younger generation is more comfortable with it, but I'm curious how you would go about communicating that to maybe an older generation.
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing. It's back to, it's emotional. It's not really rational. So you could build a rational argument and nobody's gonna be persuaded by it. It needs to be, I mean, that's actually a really good, the Ad Council hires agencies to do, to do nonprofit advertising. And we just won a Cannes Lion for a campaign we did called Mind Your Meds, which is about people leaving medication where teens can get it in the medicine cabinet, prescriptions. And, but anyway, which is a big problem. I think that's actually a really good issue for the Ad Council to take up if they haven't already. But I think it's a great question.
Thank you.
My parents are worried about it. My parents are great. They're, my dad's not. My mom is, I remember my kids, my sister's kids texting my kids saying, hide under the bed, Grandma got an iPhone. And my mother, I taught her how to, my mother is always like, tell me what, she's in Florida, she's great. She's 80 and she's the smartest person I know, and she's very modern. She's like, tell me what you're doing and all the exciting things you're doing. And I said, Mom, why don't you just follow me on Twitter? Karen Kaplan, HH, by the way. And So she gets on, so I teach her how to get on Twitter. She gets on Twitter, and then she's like not direct messaging me. She's like tweeting. She tweets me my Uncle Earl's attorney's phone number. I'm like, Mom, get off of Twitter. But my father thinks the internet is like the scariest place in the world. So, it's an issue. Great question. Thank you.
Please come on up.
Hi, thank you.
Hi.
First of all, just thanks so much for taking the time to be here and talk to us. I've learned a lot about creating inspired advertising, and it's something that I never considered as very interesting before.
Success.
But I was curious, you talked a lot about your company's philosophy and everything, but if you could tell us a little bit about your background, if you went to school, what did you study, and how did you get that first job and then rise through the ranks? What even made you qualified to keep moving up and up in the company? So I'd be really interested to hear about that.
Great.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Yeah, how much time do we have?
We have like 5 minutes.
Okay, so the short version is nothing qualified me to keep moving up in the company. So I graduated from undergraduate school, state school. I went to UMass Amherst. I actually went to 4 different undergraduate schools in 4 years, but that's a whole nother story. But I graduated from UMass Amherst, and I graduated in the middle of what's called a W recession, which is back-to-back recessions in the early 80s. And the unemployment rates were in the double digits. No one was getting, none of my peers out of undergraduate school were getting jobs. And so I decided I would go to law school, not necessarily because I want to be a lawyer, but I just thought that's, whether I want to go into, politics or business or, that's a good background. So my parents said, well, good for you. You can go to law school as soon as you've saved up some money to pay for it, because we're done at the undergrad level. And so I just was looking for a job, a low commitment 9-to-5 job, so that I could live at home, make some money, study for the LSATs, and apply to law schools. So I was taking that 1 year. That's what I thought. And I had heard of Hill Holliday growing up here. I had heard of Jack Connors, who was the then CEO at the time. And I heard from the recruiter that he had interviewed and rejected 40 candidates, and that he was personally interviewing. So I thought, well, nothing bad will come of meeting Jack Connors.
Right.
He's sort of a big swinging guy in town. And I'm competitive, so I want to see if I can get it. So I got the job. I have no idea why. He has no idea why. I always joke around saying I had good shoes on that day or something. I don't. And so I started as the receptionist. And I will tell you, the minute I got off the elevator from my interview, I actually thought, this is a pretty cool place. I liked the energy and the vibe. And, I always say I've had the same 16 jobs everybody my age has had. I've just been lucky enough to have had them all at Hill Holliday. I was the last person you would expect to stay at one company my whole career, let alone advertising, which is a very transient business. People move around like crazy in advertising, and there's nothing wrong with, being at a place for a year and then another place and another place. So every job I got, I'll just tell this, if we have a minute, I'll just tell this little story. When I was hired, when Jack Connors hired me to be the receptionist, he said something that really was, framed the way I thought about the job differently. And he said, Karen, congratulations, you are the face and the voice of Hill Holliday. And I thought, wow, that's not just some job. I'm waiting around going to law school, keeping me, that's important. And it's important to him, so it's important to me. And so I took that very seriously, and I considered myself the CEO of the reception desk. And then I considered myself the CEO of the traffic department. And then I considered myself of every job, every department, every account I ever ran. And I just did the best job I could. I loved the environment I was in, and I loved what I was doing, which I think is a prerequisite. But I just did the best I could, and I took chances. I raised my hand for every opportunity. I would literally be in a group, in a meeting, and I'd feel my hand going up, and I'd be like, oh shit, I did it again. I had no idea what I was doing, but I always figured if somebody else can figure it out, I could figure it out.
Yeah.
And
My 32-year meteoric rise. Well, that is a great story, and I don't know if I know anyone else who has a story like that at another business. I mean, that's really fantastic. Well, I want to thank you so much for coming. This was just the perfect way to kick off the course. My pleasure. And thank all of you.
Thank you.